Hi, welcome back to class. I want to talk about the meaning of the parable of the sower, or perhaps even better, the parable of the soils. Let's hear this parable. Jesus comes out in picking up with verse 3, and he's speaking to the crowds. He told them many things in parables, saying, "A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched. And since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears, let him hear." Now, Jesus then goes into verses 10 to 17, and I'm going to talk about those verses in a separate video. But let's now jump ahead to verse 18 and hear Jesus' interpretation of this parable. And notice who he speaks this to. He's not speaking to the crowds now. He's only speaking to the disciples to explain what this means. "Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on the rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while, and when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, he immediately falls away. As for what was sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches chokes the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. Now, what can we say about this thing? First of all, I kind of drew this out. We'll get back to this chart in a second, but I want to note a key thing here. This whole thing is about seed, and a sower goes out and does what? A sower sows. In the ancient world, you didn't have a lot of tech tools and things, so you're basically going out scattering seeds. And Jesus uses this common image from agriculture as a way of understanding the issue ultimately of one's receptivity to the message of the kingdom. Because notice when we look at this parable is ultimately about fruitfulness. The seed is exactly the same. That's important. So God isn't choosing who gets the special word versus who doesn't get the word. This isn't about the power of the seed. This is about the soil. This is a parable ultimately about receptivity. That's the key insight that you have to glean in order to understand what's going on here. Because Jesus isn't saying that there's something outside of our control that's going to keep one person from understanding versus another person receiving the message. That in essence, it's our own internal conditions which predetermines our receptivity. And we're going to see this as dynamic also. So the seed's the same. The only thing that's different is going to be the soil. And so Jesus talks about 4 kinds of soils in this particular parable. The first case, seed just falls on the pathway. And we notice that this gets absolutely no growth. Now, what Jesus says is the condition of the person here, this is where they don't understand the word. For whatever reason, they don't understand. And what happens to this person? The evil one comes and snatches things away. So the basic problem here is no understanding. And then because of that lack of understanding, the evil one kind of erases things. Now, notice what this doesn't say. This parable isn't saying that the evil one comes and takes away a person's ability to receive. The person didn't receive, and the evil one comes along and affirms that. Again, the evil one comes after the person doesn't understand. The evil one doesn't come to prevent understanding. Does that make sense? It's really important to see that. Then we get to the second kinds of soil. And the second and the third, and the fourth actually, all have something in common. So there is something in common on all these things. Notice that there is growth. So for a season, Rocky soil, thorny soil, and good soil are going to look exactly the same. Jesus has other parables that talk about that. We don't want to prematurely take decisions on different people. That's what we're going to see in some of these other parables, like the parable of the net, for example. So for a time, rocky soil, thorny soil, good soil looks exactly the same. Now, of course, from the outside looking in, you can't tell rocky, thorny, and good soil apart from each other. The paths, maybe you can see that, but that's just some seeds land on that. But these soils look the same on the surface. But there's something about those soils that are going to ultimately, either in two cases, prevent fruit from ever being born, or in the other case of the good soil, allowing for an abundant harvest at some point down in the future. Now, rocky soil and thorny soil both start to grow. And in fact, this text says that the rocky soil grows the fastest. It grows really quick. But that's because of its shallow nature, and so it grows up quickly, but just as quickly after it has a little sprout, the sun comes down and burns it up. Now, what's the issue here? The problem here wasn't that they didn't understand. The problem here, and Jesus lifts this up in his explanation, is the rocky soil is one that's not prepared for tribulation and persecution. So these are kind of what you might call external threats. As we saw back in Jesus sending out the disciples, there's not always going to be a positive reception of the gospel. And in fact, disciples are going to be persecuted. We see that in the world today, and Jesus is warning about that. But one of the issues is when persecution and when tribulation caused by the word. That's the key thing. This isn't just bad stuff happening. Bad stuff happens to everyone. This is tribulations and persecutions on account of the word. This causes some to fall away, no fruit. Again, the next one, the thorny soil. The seeds grow. They look great, but then all of a sudden, all these weeds come in and choke out the plant's ability to ultimately produce fruit. Now, this is an insidious one. Like in our world today, we don't see, in our context here in North America, we don't see tribulation and persecution per se. That isn't true in other parts of the world. But the thorny soil is very indicative of the context that we find ourselves in many contexts in the United States. Because what's the issue here? The problem isn't some external threat. It's really an internal threat. It's the cares of world and the deceitfulness of riches. So these are actually perhaps positive things that are taking place in a disciple's life. They become more focused on worldly riches or worldly honor than on the gospel. That's the danger, probably where many of us find ourselves in 2017 and beyond in this 21st century context. This is probably where we find ourselves in our 21st century context in North America. Riches, cares of the world tend to choke things off here. But then the good news is, and again, maybe 1/4 of the soil, we don't know how much good soil is, but there's always going to be good soil. And this is a positive message. If we keep sowing, the seed, the word, will finally fall on receptive soil. And when it does, magic happens. I've tried to draw it in the way that really radically contrasts here. But good soil yields an abundant harvest, not just a twofold harvest. It yields an abundant harvest. And notice the numbers there. It says 100-fold, 60-fold, 30-fold. And remember this, 30-fold is abundance. That's a massive takeaway. That's like sowing one seed, getting 30 apples, right? So this is serious return on investment. And what is that? That's the one that hears the word and understands it, takes it to heart, follows Jesus into the world on mission. When we get to chapter 16:24, we're going to hear that call. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his or her cross, follow me. It's going to be the essence of discipleship. In persons that answer that call, that say, I'm all in. abundant fruit. Now, we would be remiss if we didn't draw a few more implications here. This is a dynamic sequence here. This is important because you got to think about characters that show up in the Gospels. Like, for example, Peter's going to mess up quite a bit. He's worried about persecution, right? So does that mean Peter suddenly became bad fruit? Maybe for a season. So I don't think we want to read this as permanent, static conditions. Because Peter can slide from good to no fruit, but then ultimately he's one of these fruit people. Judas, obviously at some point he looks a lot like he's going to be good fruit. But Judas train wrecks and falls from good fruit to bad fruit. So we want to see this dynamic. So one of the questions that Jesus is really asking, and I'd ask it to everybody in the class and I ask it to myself, is this: what kind of soil are you? Or ask myself, what kind of soil am I? What would you say? And what would it look like for you to fully embrace the word of the kingdom so that as we follow Jesus into the world on mission, we can be persons that yield a harvest 30-fold, 60-fold, 100-fold. That's my hope and dream for everyone in this class. Dig into the word, open yourself up, be receptive to what God wants to do in your life. Avoid falling into a place of no understanding. Be prepared for difficult times of tribulation and persecution, and don't let your faith be squashed by your own desire to get ahead of everybody else, to pursue wealth, pursue honor, all the things that come with maybe worldly fame, and instead follow Jesus into the world. Become like him. You'll be glad you did. Hey, I'm Brian Russell. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, let me know.